Kelmar Voss had read the directive 17 times, which was 16 more times than he'd ever read any piece of bureaucratic documentation in his entire career as an agricultural surveyor. The problem wasn't complexity. The governing echelon prided itself on clarity, even if that clarity often manifested as 50 pages explaining what could have been summarized in a single sentence. The problem was that somewhere between paragraph 12 and paragraph 38, the directive had created what Kelmar's grandfather would have called a gap large enough to drive a harvester through. The mandate was simple. At least in theory, all personnel assigned to the Tethys 9 environmental assessment would experience the planet's conditions authentically for the duration of the first observation cycle, approximately 4 local months. This meant living without constructed shelter, to avoid environmental contamination, and to truly understand the ecosystem they were evaluating. The governing echelon, a well-meaning coalition of 7 species who had turned bureaucratic oversight into an art form, believed this approach would yield the most accurate data about planetary habitability. What the directive said was survive without shelter. What it carefully did not say was survive without building shelter. Kelmar, who had grown up on a farming colony where the difference between seed allocations and crop quotas could mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy, appreciated nuance. He stood now in his assigned zone, a coastal grassland region stretching toward dramatic cliff formations where 2 suns cast complicated shadows and wind patterns changed hourly. The grass reached his knees, golden green and dense, punctuated by clusters of grey-blue stones that looked volcanic in origin. In the distance, waves crashed against rocks with the kind of rhythmic persistence that suggested Tethys 9's weather had opinions and wasn't shy about expressing them. His colleagues were settling into their own zones. The Gentari, crystalline beings who looked like animated geology exhibits, had simply anchored themselves in sunny locations and begun their work of passive observation. They didn't sleep, didn't eat, and apparently didn't care much about weather. The Maureen researchers, amphibious and perpetually damp, had claimed the wetland territories and seemed thrilled about the whole arrangement. Even the Kess, insectoid and normally high-strung about environmental conditions, had burrowed into the sandy regions without complaint. Kelmar was the only human in this particular assessment team, which meant he was the only one for whom survive without shelter represented an actual challenge rather than a mild inconvenience. He pulled out his scanner and began walking the perimeter of his assigned territory, documenting everything. The scientific method, he'd learned long ago, was the best cover for almost any activity. If you were taking notes and collecting data, you were working. What you did with that information afterward was simply applied research. The wind hit him from the northwest, carrying salt spray and the peculiar mineral smell of Tethys 9 soil. Kelmar marked the direction, noted the temperature, comfortable now, but he'd reviewed the climate data, and comfortable on this planet was a temporary condition. The grassland experienced dramatic temperature swings, precipitation in multiple forms, and wind speeds that could charitably be described as aggressive. He spent the first 3 days simply observing, which was exactly what he'd been sent to do. He walked transects, collected soil samples, documented vegetation patterns, and established baseline environmental readings. He also noted which rock formations created natural windbreaks, which grass species grew in the densest interwoven patterns, and where water naturally pooled after the brief daily rains. On the 4th day, he began rearranging rocks. Studying structural patterns in natural formations, he noted in his daily report, which was technically true. He was studying them very carefully as he moved them into configurations that would provide a foundation. The rocks in this region were beautifully varied, some flat and stackable, others rounded and perfect for filling gaps. Kelmar documented their weight-bearing properties, their thermal retention characteristics, and their resistance to erosion as he carefully built them into a low wall that curved to deflect the prevailing winds. The grass presented an interesting challenge. The native species he designated it Tethys graminii robustus in his notes, because the official taxonomic names hadn't been assigned yet, grew in thick mats with root systems that interwove like natural fabric. When pulled carefully, entire sections came up in flexible sheets. Kelmar documented their tensile strength, their water resistance, and their insulating properties. He also documented how they could be woven together to create larger panels, how they could be layered for weather tightness, and how certain weaving patterns affected their durability. By the end of the second week, Kelmar had what might generously be called an enhanced natural formation, and what anyone with eyes would call a framework for a structure. Prism Edge visited on day 16. The Gentari moved with the peculiar gliding motion of their species, catching sunlight and refracting it in small rainbows across the grass. They communicated through a translation device that rendered their crystalline resonance into audible language. "Your sector shows unusual activity," Prism Edge observed, not accusatory but curious. "You have relocated significant geological specimens." "Studying load distribution and natural weathering patterns," Kelmar replied, which was true. He was absolutely studying those things. "I'm documenting how local materials respond to arrangement and stress. The data should be valuable for understanding natural formation development." Prism Edge's form shifted slightly. A gesture Kelmar had learned indicated consideration. "Your arrangement resembles structural patterns, deliberate construction. All construction is just intentional arrangement," Kelmar said. "I'm being very intentional about my observations." The Zentari spent several minutes examining the foundation, the partially completed walls, and the bundles of woven grass Kelmar had prepared. "This will provide protection from weather," Prism Edge noted. "This will provide an excellent observation point for studying weather," Kelmar corrected. "How can I properly document storm systems if I'm hypothermic?" Prism Edge made a sound like wind chimes in a breeze, which the translator rendered as thoughtful laughter. "Humans find interesting spaces in language. We're adaptable," Kelmar agreed. "It's what we do." The Zentari departed without filing any kind of report, and Kelmar continued his work. The first major storm arrived in week 3, announced by official warnings from the orbital station. The governing echelon sent detailed messages about seeking natural protection and minimizing exposure to extreme conditions. Kelmar read them from inside his hut, because at this point pretending it was anything else would have been absurd, and noted with satisfaction that his structure was holding perfectly. He'd finished the walls just in time, filling the gaps between stones with a mud mixture that dried surprisingly hard. The roof was his proudest achievement, layers of woven grass panels overlapping like scales, angled to shed water, with a slight peak to prevent pooling. He'd even created a small vestibule area using bent saplings and additional grass panels, which provided a buffer zone for equipment and kept the main interior space dry. The storm itself wasn't dramatic in the way orbital bombardments or reactor failures were dramatic. It was dramatic in the way that truly miserable weather is dramatic, relentless, grinding, and personally offensive. Rain fell horizontally, driven by wind that seemed to have a vendetta against the concept of dryness. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The double suns vanished behind clouds that looked like bruises, and the world became a grey howl of water and wind. Inside his hut, Kelmar continued working. He'd set up a small interior workspace with a field table and organized equipment storage. His thermal study apparatus, a collection of stones arranged to contain and radiate heat from combustible native plant material, kept the interior comfortable. He documented soil sample analysis, reviewed vegetation response data from his perimeter sensors, and updated his notes on microclimate variations. The roof leaked in exactly 2 places during the first hour. Kelmar marked them, waited for a brief reduction in wind speed, and patched both spots with additional grass panels and mud sealant. By hour 3, the structure was weather-tight. On the second day of the storm, Gelthrax appeared. The Maureen researcher moved through the deluge like it was a pleasant spring shower, their amphibious form actually seeming happier in the wet conditions. They paused outside Kelmar's hut, their large eyes blinking through the rain. "Your observation post is elaborate," Gelthrax noted, their voice carrying easily over the storm. The Maureen didn't need translation devices. They'd learned human languages with the ease of beings who communicated partially through vibration and frequency. "I'm thorough," Kelmar replied. "Would you like to come in? I'm heating water for tea." Gelthrax's expression, difficult to read on an amphibious face, suggested amusement. They entered the vestibule, shook off approximately half a liter of water, and settled onto a stone Kelmar had positioned as a seat. The thermal study apparatus did double duty as a water heater. Kelmar had collected local plants that, when dried and steeped, produced something that wasn't quite tea but was warm and vaguely pleasant. He poured 2 cups and handed one to Gelthrax. The governing echelon specified no constructed shelter, Gelthrax observed, sipping the not tea. "This isn't constructed," Kelmar said. "It's arranged. I haven't fabricated anything. Every material came from within my assigned observation zone. The distinction seems philosophical. Philosophy is important. How we define things matters." Gelthrax made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been water displacement. "Humans are skilled at definitions. You find flexibility where others see constraints." "We find solutions," Kelmar corrected. "There's a difference between breaking rules and understanding them well enough to work within them properly." They spent the next hour discussing erosion patterns, sediment deposits, and the surprising diversity of microorganisms Gelthrax had documented in the wetlands. The storm hammered the roof without penetrating it. Water ran off the sloped panels in efficient streams that Kelmar had directed away from the foundation using carefully placed stones. When Gelthrax left, they paused at the entrance. "Your methodology is unconventional but effective. I suspect the governing echelon did not anticipate human interpretation of their directive." "They probably should have," Kelmar said. "We've been building shelters since we figured out that caves were nice but limited in availability. The storm lasted 4 days. Kelmar's hut performed admirably. By day 3, his reports had shifted to include detailed observations about human-environment interaction patterns and structural stability in arranged natural materials. He documented how his presence and his structure had created a small ecosystem hub. Several small avian analogues had taken shelter in the roof overhang. A burrowing creature he'd designated Tethys tunnella minimus had created a warren system around the foundation, apparently appreciating the improved drainage. When Prism Edge returned after the storm, they brought questions and official curiosity. The crystalline being had weathered the 4 days by simply existing through them. The Zentared didn't mind weather, they just refracted it. But satellite imaging had flagged Kelmar's location as an unexpected structural anomaly. "The orbital station has noted your sector's development," Prism Edge said, settling near the hut's entrance. Kelmar had built a small cleared area that functioned as a porch, though he'd officially designated it an observation platform for meteorological study. "Development is a strong word," Kelmar replied. "I've been conducting hands-on research. The research has produced a building. The research has produced documented evidence of indigenous material properties under deliberate arrangement," Kelmar corrected. He gestured to his extensive notes. "I have detailed recordings of structural load distribution, weathering effects, thermal efficiency, and long-term stability. This is all valuable data about Tethys 9's resources." Prism Edge's form shifted through several colors, a sign of processing and consideration. "You were instructed to survive without shelter. And I am," Kelmar said. "I'm surviving very well." The directive specified no prefabricated shelter, no imported materials, no technological environmental systems. I've used none of those things. Everything here came from the planet. I've simply arranged it in a way that allows me to continue my work effectively. You built a shelter. I created an educational demonstration of indigenous material capabilities, Kelmar countered. If you want to call it a shelter, that's your interpretation. I call it applied research with practical benefits. The Zentarid was silent for a long moment, their crystalline structure catching the emerging sunlight and scattering it in geometric patterns. The directive's language was ambiguous, they finally said. "Most directives are," Kelmar agreed. "That's not a flaw. It's just the nature of trying to write universal guidelines for multiple species with different needs and capabilities. The governing echelon did their best. You exploited that ambiguity." "I worked within it," Kelmar said. "There's a difference. I haven't violated any actual rule. I've just recognized that the space between prohibited and required contains a lot of room for practical decision-making." Prism Edge examined the hut carefully, their crystalline senses apparently running some kind of analysis. "Your construction uses no synthetic materials. All components are local. The structure itself could be classified as an extension of the natural environment, intentionally arranged." "Exactly. The governing echelon may disagree with this interpretation," Kelmar shrugged. "They might. But I've documented everything. My reports are thorough, accurate, and demonstrate significant research value. If they want to argue that I shouldn't have learned about load-bearing properties by actually testing them, that's a conversation we can have." The Zentarid remade their wind chime sound again. "You are confident they will accept this logic?" "I'm confident my work is solid, and my reasoning is sound," Kelmar said. "Beyond that, I'm just doing my job the best way I know how. If that happens to include not being miserable in the rain, well, that's just efficient resource management." Prism Edge departed without filing any kind of complaint, noting only that the human sector was proceeding with characteristic innovation. Kelmar considered that a diplomatic victory. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that Kelmar found deeply satisfying. His days involved genuine survey work, comprehensive soil analysis, detailed weather tracking, vegetation sampling across multiple microclimates within his zone. But they also involved the maintenance and gradual improvement of his hut, because any good structure required attention and refinement. He developed a water collection system, using large leaves arranged in channels that directed rainfall into a stone basin. He'd carved and sealed with clay. The system provided fresh water without the need for filtration, and the basin itself became a study in mineral deposition and algae growth. He documented everything. His drying rack for vegetation samples doubled as a space to preserve local edibles he'd been testing. Kelmar had learned early in his surveying career that understanding what a planet could feed you was as important as understanding what it could house you. Several of the local plants, when properly prepared, were actually quite palatable. His reports included detailed nutritional analysis and preparation methods, all framed as essential habitability data. The hut itself became a research site. Kelmar documented how the structure's presence altered local wind patterns, creating a small sheltered microclimate that extended several meters beyond the walls. He recorded temperature differentials between the interior and exterior spaces across various weather conditions. He mapped how the foundation affected water flow and drainage patterns. The avian analogues nesting in his roof became subjects of behavioral study. The burrowing creatures around his foundation provided data on soil composition and underground architecture. His presence, and his comfortable, well-built presence, had created a small ecosystem hub that offered insights into how habitation structures integrated with native environments. Kelmar wasn't trying to dominate the environment. He was simply existing within it in the most sensible way possible, and the environment was adjusting around him the way environments do when something new and relatively benign gets added to the system. The second major storm arrived in week 8, and this time it meant business. The orbital officials sent urgent communications about evacuation options, suggesting that personnel might want to return to the station temporarily. Kelmar read these messages while reinforcing his doorframe and replied that his observation station was suitable for continued work. He wasn't the only one who thought so. As the storm front approached, he noticed his colleagues gravitating toward his sector. Gelthrax positioned himself in a nearby depression that would catch runoff, perfect for the Maureen, who thrived in flowing water. Prism Edge anchored in a rock cluster within sight of the hut, where the crystal being could weather the storm while maintaining what Kelmar suspected was protective proximity. Even a Kess researcher named Skittering Leaf, who usually avoided other species, created a burrow uncomfortably close to Kelmar's perimeter. The storm was worse than the first one. Not more dramatic, weather wasn't theater, it was physics, but more sustained and more severe. Wind speeds increased steadily until the grass lay flat and even the stones seemed to hunker down. Rain fell in sheets, then in walls, then in what appeared to be entire oceans being emptied from the sky. The temperature dropped until Kelmar's breath fogged inside the hut, even with his thermal apparatus running. The structure held. Kelmar had built well, and more importantly, he'd built with an understanding of materials and stress points that came from generations of human trial and error. The walls stood firm. The roof shed water without leaking. The foundation stayed dry and stable. But nothing was perfect, and weather this persistent found weaknesses. On day 2, Kelmar noticed water seeping through a section of the north wall where wind had created pressure differentials. He waited for a brief calm period, went outside, and reinforced the section with additional mud sealant and a double layer of grass panels. On day 3, one of his roof supports shifted slightly under the sustained weight of accumulated water. He braced it from inside, using a fallen branch he'd stored for exactly this kind of purpose. Maintenance was just part of the process. Buildings weren't static objects, they were ongoing negotiations between human intention and natural forces. On day 4, during a momentary lull in the wind, Kelmar emerged to check his perimeter and found Prism Edge in trouble. The rock cluster where the Zentari had anchored was flooding, water pooling faster than it could drain, and threatening to submerge the crystalline being entirely. The Zentari could survive water, but prolonged submersion affected their ability to process light and energy. Kelmar grabbed his shovel, officially a soil sampling implement, and began redirecting water flow. He dug a channel leading away from Prism Edge's position, reinforced it with stones to prevent collapse, and created a secondary drainage path that tied into the natural slope of the terrain. "You are assisting," Prismedge observed, their voice sounding strained through the translator. "I'm studying rapid erosion intervention," Kelmar replied, digging steadily. "Very valuable data. Also, you're my colleague, and letting you drown in runoff would be poor form." The Zentari didn't respond, but their crystalline structure pulsed with a warm amber light that Kelmar had learned indicated gratitude. The storm finally broke on day 5. The wind died to nothing, the rain stopped with abrupt finality, and both suns emerged to shine on a landscape that looked scrubbed and exhausted. Kelmar's hut stood intact, its walls solid and its roof unmarred, except for a few spots where grass panels would need replacement, routine maintenance, nothing structural. His colleagues emerged from their various shelters and positions. Gelthrax looked refreshed, practically glowing with hydration. Prismedge's crystalline form had returned to its normal prismatic clarity. Even Skittering Leaf ventured out, their insectoid form chittering inspection of their survived burrow. They gathered near Kelmar's hut without discussion, a spontaneous meeting that suggested his structure had become an unofficial hub. Kelmar served the not-quite tea he'd developed and listened as his colleagues compared storm data and observations. "The human sector showed remarkable stability," Prismedge noted. "Your structure weathered conditions that stressed natural formations. Good building practices," Kelmar said. "And an understanding that weather isn't an enemy to be defeated. It's just a condition to be accommodated. Your species builds frequently," Gelthrax observed. "On your home world on colonies. Now here, construction appears to be a fundamental human behavior. We're tool users," Kelmar agreed. "And shelters are just large-scale tools. We've been making them for so long that it's less about innovation and more about applying accumulated knowledge. The governing echelon may consider this when they review assessment protocols," Prismedge said carefully. "Your approach demonstrates that species-specific adaptations require species-specific accommodations." Kelmar smiled. "Diplomatic way of saying, I found a loophole. Diplomatic way of saying you identified practical flexibility in overly rigid guidelines," Prismedge corrected. "There is value in both rule following and rule understanding." The gathering dispersed eventually, everyone returning to their work. Kelmar spent the afternoon conducting post-storm analysis, documenting everything from soil saturation levels to structural integrity assessments. His reports were models of thorough research, each observation tied to measurable data and practical conclusions. Administrator Quelix arrived in week 10. The Yenith avian descended, elegant and thoroughly committed to procedural compliance, descended from the orbital station in an official transport and landed precisely on the boundary of Kelmar's sector. They emerged with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested this visit was officially significant. "Surveyor Voss," Quelix said, their translator rendering their natural vocalizations into clipped formal language. "I am conducting a site inspection regarding the structural anomaly designated in satellite imaging reports." "Welcome, Administrator," Kelmar replied. "I'm happy to show you my research station." "Your research station," Quelix repeated, their avian eyes fixing on the hut with what appeared to be skepticism. "You have constructed a building. I have arranged indigenous materials into a configuration that facilitates ongoing research," Kelmar said. "Would you like a tour? I have extensive documentation." The tour took an hour. Kelmar walked Quelix through every aspect of the hut, explaining each component in exhaustive academic detail. The roof demonstrated water-shedding properties of native grasses and optimal weaving patterns for weather resistance. The walls showed thermal efficiency of stacked stone and mud construction, with detailed measurements of temperature retention. The interior layout maximized air circulation patterns while minimizing wasted space. The foundation illustrated drainage principles and load distribution across varied geological substrates. He presented his documentation with the thoroughness of someone who had always intended to defend this work. Charts showed structural stress analysis. Graphs documented weather performance across multiple storm events. Photographs catalogued construction phases tied to research observations. Reports detailed material properties, environmental integration, and even the ecosystem development that had occurred around the structure. Quelix examined everything with meticulous attention. They measured walls, tested the roof, inspected the foundation. They reviewed documentation, cross-referenced reports, and checked satellite imaging against physical reality. Finally, they stood in the center of the hut and fixed Kelmar with an unreadable expression. "You were instructed to survive without shelter." "Yes," Kelmar agreed. "This is shelter. This is a field research station constructed from indigenous materials, using only manual labor and demonstrating significant data about planetary resource utilization," Kelmar said. "If it happens to also function as shelter, that's an incidental benefit of thorough research design. You exploited ambiguity in the directive." "I worked within the parameters as stated," Kelmar replied. "The directive specified no prefabricated shelter. This is hand-built. The directive required minimal intervention. This structure uses less energy and resources than the emergency pods most personnel carried. The directive emphasized authentic environmental experience. I have experienced this environment extensively and documented every aspect of that experience." Quelix was silent for a long moment. Their feathers ruffled slightly, a sign of processing that Kelmar had learned to recognize. "Your interpretation is creative. My interpretation is practical," Kelmar said. "I'm a surveyor. My job is to assess whether environments can support habitation. How better to do that than by actually demonstrating habitation techniques using only local resources?" The governing echelon did not intend this outcome. "With respect, Administrator, I'm not certain the governing echelon fully considered the implications of their directive for species with different environmental requirements. The Centauri don't need shelter. The marine prefer exposure to moisture. The Kess burrow instinctively. Humans build. It's what we do, and it's not a character flaw. It's an adaptive strategy that has served us well across hundreds of colony worlds." Quelix examined the hut again, their expression thoughtful. "You believe the directive was flawed. I believe the directive was written with excellent intentions and insufficient consideration for human needs," Kelmar said carefully. "I don't fault the governing echelon. Multi-species policy is complicated, but I also don't think it's unreasonable for me to have worked within the stated parameters in a way that kept me alive and functional." The administrator spent another 30 minutes in examination and documentation. They took extensive notes, recorded measurements, and compiled what appeared to be an official report. When they finally prepared to leave, they turned to Kelmar with an expression that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "I am classifying this structure as an indigenous material field laboratory," Quelix announced. "Your research has demonstrated valuable data about Tethys 9 resource applications. Your methodology, while unconventional, appears to fall within technical compliance of the directive as written. Thank you, Administrator. The governing echelon will be updating directive language for future assessment protocols," Quelix added. "For clarity." "That seems wise," Kelmar agreed. Quelix departed, their transport lifting off with characteristic Yenith precision. Kelmar watched them go and returned to his work. He had soil samples to process and weather data to compile. The fact that he'd do so while comfortable and dry was simply good sense. The assessment period concluded in week 16. Kelmar received notification that personnel would be returning to the orbital station for data compilation and preliminary reporting. He was scheduled for transport in 2 days. He spent those days completing his documentation with characteristic thoroughness. His final report was a masterpiece of comprehensive research, detailed analysis of soil composition, vegetation patterns, weather systems, and ecosystem dynamics. It included extensive documentation of human-environment interaction studies, with his hut serving as a primary case study in sustainable integration using indigenous resources. He noted in his concluding remarks that the structure could remain as a field station for future researchers, as it required no external power, no maintenance beyond what local materials could provide, and had proven durable through multiple extreme weather events. It demonstrated, he wrote, that human habitation on Tethys 9 was not only possible but could be achieved with minimal environmental impact using only planetary resources. On his last morning, Kelmar stood outside his hut and looked at what he'd built. It wasn't impressive by architectural standards, just a small, well-constructed shelter using ancient techniques and local materials. But it was solid, it was functional, and it had kept him alive and comfortable for 4 months on an alien world. More importantly, it had proven a point that humans had been proving since they first crawled out of caves and decided the world could be more comfortable. Survival wasn't about domination or brute force. It was about paying attention, understanding systems, and working with available resources to create spaces where life could flourish. He locked the door, a simple latch he'd carved from hardwood, and left the key on a stone by the entrance. The next researcher who needed shelter would find it waiting. The transport arrived precisely on schedule. Kelmar gathered his equipment, took one last look at his sector, and departed Tethys 9 without ceremony. His hut remained behind, a small structure on a grassland plain, surrounded by the ecosystem that had grown up around it. 6 months later, the governing echelon quietly updated their environmental assessment directives. The new language specified no constructed habitation of any kind, which everyone agreed was much clearer, and removed any ambiguity about building structures during observation periods. By then 3 other species had built their own versions of field stations on Tethys 9 using techniques documented in Kelmar's reports. Because good ideas tend to spread regardless of whether officials initially intended them. The Zentari had created elegant crystal formations that focused light and created sheltered spaces. The Maureen had engineered water flow systems that provided both habitat and research stations. Even the Kess had designed communal burrow complexes that doubled as underground laboratories. The governing echelon, faced with multiple successful adaptations of Kelmar's approach, eventually classified these structures as essential research infrastructure and stopped trying to prevent what was clearly inevitable. When you send intelligent beings to study a planet, they will make themselves comfortable, because comfort isn't a luxury, it's the foundation of good work. Kelmar, assigned to a new survey on a different world with different weather and different officials, read the updated directives with quiet satisfaction and began his site assessment. The new planet had interesting geological formations, abundant vegetation, and promising indigenous materials. He started taking notes immediately. After all, good research required thorough documentation, and you never knew what you might need to build.